Welcome to the unofficial, no longer part of Yahoo, making the rounds with Emily and me, Kelsey. Sorry that the overlay is terrible. I promise I'm having someone whose passion is not graphic design. Get the meme? Okay. Make a much better one, but for now this is what we have. Since it's Rift Rivals, I have NA above Emily and Europe above myself. It's whatever. But the point is that we had some pretty exciting games today, and we're going to try to be diligent about making one of these at least about every day of NAEU. We'll see what else we do from there. And we wanted to talk about, like, I guess, kind of the unexpected situation where we had NA going 4-2. A lot of these scaling comps that EU were pulling off were really not working for them. So the first thing that we kind of want to talk about are these drafts, because they were really, really weird. Like, there was always, I feel, a very clear draft winner, and it came down to, like, one team would have 3 winning lanes and a winning jungle matchup, which is just, I only see that stuff in LPL, let's be honest. Like, only in LPL do you lose draft this badly.
But in LPL, the Kog'Maw is supposed to win, and he didn't.
I mean, in EU, usually the Twitch wins, right? That's the other version.
He did not have a good day today either. Yeah, it's always weird going into these international events, and I can't help but, like, not keep recalling Mithy's words back at MSI, where they were like, well, if we mess up our early game, we can just kind of sit back and then wait against TSM for them to screw up in the mid game. And I think a lot of people, so like when I talk to a lot of people about either scaling compositions or about like the 20 to 40, not as a meme, but actually as like the mid to late game, and people always bring up SKT, and I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that if you are playing that kind of composition, it really relies on not only your opponent making mistakes, you being able to capitalize on them, and you making fewer mistakes yourself. And that's a risk if you're North America or if you're Europe. Like, I'm not even singling out a particular region here because we saw it on both sides, but I think for me, this was a really good example of maybe why you don't always want to play in that style just because one of the best teams or the best team in the world plays that way.
Yeah, and I think it's even more extreme because you're obviously invoking SKT here, and not even SKT have really been playing like that. I think it's really interesting, actually, that SKT have been kind of the Lane Kingdom region. Or not SKT, Korea have been kind of the Lane Kingdom region since the mid-season change. You see a lot of teams in Europe and China, and I think less so in NA. And this is why I thought that NA would fall victim to this kind of meta, is because it's been working so well in Europe and China, because teams make so many more mistakes. And so if you just bring a ton of engage and a ton of scaling, like, it's really easy to punish teams. Like, Fnatic played a lot of this 1-3-1, where they were catching people off on the sideline, and this is, like, actually typically not how Fnatic play. Like, the Fnatic we saw today was not typically that Fnatic, but they have changed more and more since they lost to Raka and reverted more and more to this style where they don't want to push their side lanes past river, and they will just, like, shove the side lane a couple waves, and then they will look for a flank mid. And this is the way that typically the meta is being played in Europe, where you're just shoving the side lane, and then you're trying to hard engage mid with, like, either your pick setup or something of that nature. And the only team that I feel in Europe, the only top team that is still playing this more considered 1-3-1 style, or this more early game focused style, is Misfits, and they don't have the best execution, so it's really not getting punished. And even when I interviewed Sheepy from Unicorns last week, he said he kind of said we keep getting away with it, right? So there's even this acknowledgement that this isn't necessarily the best way to play the game, but it's working because there are so many mistakes.
I mean, for North America, it's kind of the same, but a different play style because as we saw a few North American teams struggling with today, not, I wouldn't say TSM necessarily, but C9 and P1 for sure, is that a lot of North American teams don't know how to use their side lane waves like at all. So they'll just group mid without prepping those waves. And I think today was a good, I don't even want to say wake up call, but like I did see, I think Phoenix One's probably the best example, adjust a bit in their second game today, which was really nice to see because at these international events, if you push these teams out of North America where everyone kind of just, there's like a magnet. It's like when you're really young and you're playing soccer and you haven't learned how to play the game yet. So you have like all these 6-year-olds and they're all just trying to kick the ball at once. That's North America with the mid lane. So I think this tournament's actually really good because I already saw like sure, they're not executing perfectly, but we already saw adaptation by the end of the day. And I think it's one of the reasons why they ended up 4-2. I will say that there are a couple of other things that happen. Like, for example, G2 for a while was pretty close to winning game 1 because their team fighting was a lot better than TSM's until TSM figured out how to use their composition around like, the fight was like exactly at 30 minutes and like 20 seconds, I think, when they finally used the ults in a really great way. So there was also a bit of that where we saw even the teams that drafted some of the earlier strong laning comps when it came time to mid-game took a little bit of time to figure it out. But yeah, I'm just glad to see North American teams learning what side lanes are.
Yeah, I also want to talk a lot about the way that people were sort of responding to some of these games. Like the Fnatic P1 game where people were like, oh, you know, Fnatic should feel so bad that this game is so close to P1, but like Fnatic picked 2 losing 2v2s, like the top jungle 2v2 and the bottom lane 2v2 were both losing 2v2s. And I feel like P1 should have punished them much more for that, so I'm actually glad that C9 did, right? Like C9 had a much more decisive, and the interesting thing about, like, I feel maybe the strongest games that we saw today were G2 versus it was G2 versus P1, right? Yeah.
G2 versus C9.
Oh, G2 versus C9. Yeah, that's right, because C9 adapted after that game.
Yeah.
G2 versus C9 and C9 versus Fnatic to an extent. Because those were the teams that started out playing like all the losing lanes, and then the second game they played, they had all winning lanes. It was like they adapted and learned. So I think that was an interesting thing to see. So I'm glad that C9 ended up punishing Fnatic for that, so maybe the disease will spread. But
I was surprised. I think the one thing I did want to point out about Phoenix One as well that I really liked is not that, like, I don't want to come out and say, like, Mike, because whenever I say, like, oh, maybe they shouldn't play this, I think people always take it as they can't play it, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if the team wants to play well, they might want to always make sure that Mike Young is on a snowballing, like, early game jungler. I thought the Gragas pick was a little weird for him when Elise was up. When they gave away the Zac and their first game.
The reason why they did that, though, is because they gave Zac up, and then the Gragas-Zac matchup is, like, the cooldowns for ult and the cooldowns for Gragas E match up to Zac's engage. So in teamfights, theoretically, Gragas can counter Zac. So I think that's why they went for the Gragas Caitlyn. And then Gragas Caitlyn has like a really strong combination because the amount of disengage and range that you can have with that pickup. So I think it made a lot of sense that they went that rotation. I actually really liked P1's draft that game in general. But yeah,
I
like
think it's rough for them only because, and maybe this is just me, I'm not sure where to put Mike Young yet. Like, I'm not, like, I know there are people who are like, he's amazing and he's like this next, like, NA jungle god. I still think that a lot of the things, so I think he's not just like a dumb mechanical player. I actually think he's done some really intelligent things. Um, but I also think that maybe just, especially since he is so new, the team might not know how to play around him when he's on that kind of pick, rather than the snowbally, like, early game stuff that we've seen him on. Like, obviously they banned in Italy, but Elise is another one. Lee was the one he pulled out today and looked really good on. And he actually, his Gragas was pretty good in team fights. He had like a few pretty good ults too. So,
and I would say Gragas is like this right now is a jungler that's a little bit on the cusp of being a late game scaling jungler and an early game pressure jungler, because you can have like a pretty effective early games. I think the one thing that Mike Young does for P1 is that right now you can actually get by pretty far just by ganking top lane in the current meta, just because of how snowbally these picks are and like the long lane, and people still haven't figured out really how to counter Elise. So I think that that's something that they get from him, is that it seems to be like he seems to understand the top lane gank pass and that sort of setup. So I wouldn't say that he's a super multi-dimensional jungler yet, but I think that that's something that he's helped the team with that they didn't necessarily have before.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so Fnatic, though, are interesting because I did have a chance to interview Boxa, and he said that they don't care that much about winning this tournament so much as figuring out how to make themselves more multi-dimensional, so they're not easy to counter, and that's why they're playing with the different things that they're playing with. So I think that's something to consider as well, is that maybe not every team at this tournament is here to just like win the tournament.
I actually know that again, this is according to Smoothie, but like C9 is kind of approaching it in the same way, because they recognize that they can't win like internationally the way they've been playing, especially with how they treat their early game, right? So, and I think it showed today in how they ended up adapting. But I know that they came in most of their interviews, including one I did with Smoothie, where they were like, we really just want to use this as an opportunity to not even experiment, but just learn new things as a team, like learn how to execute maybe a slightly different style than what we typically do in North America, because I mean, every region becomes kind of insular. And so I do think this is going to be, like, just based on this first day, I think it's going to be a good thing for all of the teams that come here, if they are treating it like that, like a learning experience.
Okay, so so we sort of touched on the side lane control for NA and how that developed a little bit. Yeah, how is there anything you wanted to add to that, or?
I mean, I just liked, so using C9 and P1, like I think those were the two teams that I really liked their adaptation in terms of how they paid attention to their side lanes in their second game. TSM is a little bit weird to me because I still feel like they're winning. So like with P1 and C9, I saw slight adaptations from their game 1 to game 2. With TSM, I think they're still kind of winning in a very similar way to the way they won in North America. And I think of the three teams, they have the best understanding of at least how to like prep and use side lane waves to leverage other points on the map. I don't know if you disagree with that. I actually also like, as weird as it sounds, because I know most people are going to say, well, Impact is a better player. I like how C9 are playing with Ray a little bit more than how they're playing with Impact. And I don't know if it's because previously when we saw Ray coming in, he was always using this very heavy split pushing style that sometimes hurt them because it didn't seem like either he knew when to pressure or his team didn't know how to make the most of when he was splitting off and when they were trying to do a 4-1. And that was their default style with him because it didn't seem like he knew how to group up with flanks or team fight with the team like Impact did. However, I really like him this split with C9 because I think it opens them up to a few different picks, and I also think that they've learned a lot better how to play around his split push pressure. Wow, I can't talk today. So I liked Ray, and I think that C9 should consider subbing him in a little bit more when they return to North America as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing also about the sidelines is it favors NA a little bit, that it is sort of difficult to play around side lanes, and even the European teams are a little bit afraid to play in the sidelines as much, because if you go forward too much with all of these engage picks, and if you show side lane and they have more people mid, they'll just hard engage you really easily. And it puts a lot of emphasis on river control and setting up the map in that way, which you can only really do if you have the lead mid and everything else. So it's a bit trickier to play these 1-3-1 or trade sides on the map if you don't have mid control in place and you aren't diligent about like when they're going to engage from or where they're going to engage from, which is part of the reason why I think it's been difficult for regions other than the LCK to play like 1-3-1 right now, and to really make the Renekton and Elise kind of combos stick, because that's been the tricky part. So you just make way more mistakes, and it's easier to punish these types of mistakes now with these picks. So I think that's a little bit helpful, that NA teams don't necessarily have to have like the perfect 1-3-1 to succeed right now.
Yeah, and I also think for most of the top NA teams, having, and this isn't even just teams at this tournament, but I think we saw it a bit today from both Europe and NA, having the roaming pick supports is huge, and also ties into why it is a little bit harder to have a side lane focus. If you have roaming Blitzcrank or a roaming Thresh and you don't have mid control and you don't have vision, it's really difficult to do a lot because you always have to be worried that, like, I mean, we saw kind of Mithy go off with the way they used their vision line around the Blitzcrank, and I thought that in that game they did a really good job of making sure that they kept like pushing their vision up, and Mithy was just roaming and throwing out hooks everywhere. I actually that was like probably my favorite game of the day, I'd say.
Yeah, it was actually pretty fun to see. I think the Blitzcrank has been pretty interesting. I think that we saw a couple of good Blitzcranks today. So just in general, again, I think it's really important when you're playing Blitzcrank to have mid lane pushed out, to have the wards that you want to use, and I think you actually have to kind of be ahead to make Blitzcrank really effective. I think that you can use Blitzcrank if you're behind, because you can pick someone out of position and that sort of thing, but I think to make Blitzcrank super effective and to have like really, really good Blitzcrank games, you have to be ahead kind of, and use this as a threat when you're taking control of jungle. And so
you definitely have to have a good handle on the mid lane, because I mean, we saw, and then we're going to talk about UOL like in their own kind of bubble as well, but we saw what happened with Hylissang trying to come back on Blitzcrank, and he was pretty ineffective just because their mid lane collapsed really early in that game. And I think it made it pretty difficult for what they wanted to do with the Twitch Blitzcrank lane. and it kind of just like bled out everywhere, and they couldn't use it aggressively to make those picks.
Yeah, Unicorns of Love are interesting in terms of. We may as well just talk about them now because it's a
Yeah,
pretty good transition. Uh, and I don't have a lot more to say about Blitz anyway. It's just like everyone was super critical of Move last year when he was on UOL, and they would say that oh, he's giving up so much of his jungle just to do these really really risky ganks mid, right? And I kept saying repeatedly, it's like Exile needs someone to always be in his lane. Like, he needs to have his hand held. And with Xerxes, they've taken a very different approach because Xerxes is a much more independent jungler. And he wants to, like, facilitate communication between top and bot and that type of style. So he'll play these much more scaling picks that aren't necessarily going to have a huge early game impact. So he'll play like the Warwick and the like he brought out the Ivern, he brought out the Hecarim. These types of picks that will be effective in team fights, but not necessarily early because it's really hard to have pressure when your mid lane is not doing well. So they just kind of abandon Exile and they try to win through side lanes and convert like bottom lane pressure to mid. So if unicorns don't win bottom, they just fall apart completely because they have no way to transfer pressure from any lane. And yeah, so it's kind of a mess for them right now. If like I feel like the way to beat UOL is just to pick like a winning bot lane matchup, and we saw even Nip have success doing this. So, I mean, for me, it's really troublesome. Cause we were watching I was watching in the press room, and it was the TSM UOL game, and they said, is Lucian ADC good? It's like, well, Lucian Braum was like one of the first lanes that people were picking to counter Zyra Rakan. And so it's just, that's why it was there, that game. And TSM shut UOL down doing that. Like, it's pretty easy to shut UOL down. And it's, the stupid cartoon meme. It's like, they can't keep getting away with this. Or no, it's not. Cartoon is Breaking Bad, I guess. And, I mean, they're finally not. Right? And I think that's going to be really big and really significant for them. Is UOL have always been a team that have kind of gotten away with having really, really bare bones approach or really, really formulaic style. And I think that if you're keeping your roster, you don't have to bring up new rookies every split anymore. So you've kept your roster. We really need to start demanding and expecting more from Unicorns than to just be a team that has good communication between top and bottom and can team fight well. I mean, that we have to have higher expectations for them now, and they haven't really met them yet, so that's hopefully this tournament is good for them.
Yeah, I was gonna say I hope they can take it and adapt, because even with like I was paying more attention to the mid jungle duos, and I think especially in the game against TSM, even though the Phoenix 1 game was a little bit rougher to watch, I guess, but they also picked a Twitch blitz into Kalista Thresh, which I think Kalista Thresh is like one of the strongest lanes you can get right now, and then they picked Ryze into, or not into, but they picked Ryze. It was a Ryze Corki matchup. And so, obviously, that did not work out well, but in the TSM game, they at least had Corki, and then they had Zyra Khan. And I think TSM, like, if TSM's good at one thing, it's picking, like, a good champion for Bjergsen, where he can control the game, like Syndra, And then the only losing matchup they had was the Nara Aurelia, which looked pretty good for Vizicsacsi early because he got the 2 solo kills. But then, to your point, they couldn't transition that into actually creating pressure. And when it came time to team fight, Vizicsacsi was not able to get into the backline onto either Doublelift or Bjergsen very well. So I think that was another like huge problem for them, was that they actually had a pretty good advantage for the Aurelia in the top lane, and they weren't able to snowball that or use that whatsoever, because they lost mid pressure a lot, and because Xerxes was kind of farming up on Hecarim.
Do we have to then, like, with the problems with Fnatic and UOL, do we have to say that, like, G2 are kind of the hope for Europe, or is that, like, too difficult to say?
I think it's going to depend on how the teams adjust from today, but so, like, before I answer this question, I just think it's kind of funny because we brought this up on on League Weekly, and we were like, oh, is it time to just throw G2 aside because, you know, they look like, when is it time to stop it just defaulting to the fact that G2 is the best team and they're still ramping up? So I just think it's really funny that a week later, after day 1 of Rift Rivals, we're asking, is G2 like the only hope for Europe? It's what the winning, so like the team with the best record from each side, right, gets to play each other. Is that how they changed it for this one?
I think that's, and there's 1v5.
Yeah.
But I think for me, I don't think G2, like, this tournament means G2 are the best team in Europe. I think that they're still probably the worst of the 3. And, I mean, not to use an excuse or a meme, but I think European teams always start international tournaments, like, really poorly on first day. So hopefully, like, we'll have some more BO1s tomorrow and we'll see what has popped up for them. I do think that, like, because Fnatic and UOL have, like, 2 rookies each, they both actually did really want to do well to an extent. Just for the sake of the rookie players who haven't seen that much international competition, and they wanted to, like, really kind of prove something. Especially UOL, I think. So hopefully they can impress us a little bit more tomorrow. Yeah, so I think for me, it's G2 just, they don't understand how to juggle pressure across the map right now. They don't, like, expect us constantly getting caught out. Other members of the team are constantly getting caught out. I'm not really sure, like, Trick seems really confused, and either he just kind of does bad invades, or he ganks mid randomly when he shouldn't be ganking mid and loses mid 2v2 or loses top 2v2. So I have a really hard time saying that G2 are going to be the best, even with the fact that Fnatic, I guess for me, Fnatic, the fact that they're trying different things, it's not as dire for me. But for UOL, it's like they're gimmicky and they're one-dimensional. But even then, I feel like if they hit a stride, they'll be stronger than G2, whereas G2 are having, like, problems that are just, they can't even play the usual way they play, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think, so for looking at, like, I have more, so in terms of, like, hope, if teams, like, look at these games today and adjust, I actually have the most faith in Fnatic. Because I like their combo of veteran players and rookies a lot, actually. And then for G2, the player I'm looking at the most is actually Trick. Like, I remember in, I think it was game 1, they were talking about his Rek'Sai path, and they're like, oh, you can do two things here. You can either like get the level 4 or you can like gank top early. And I was just laughing to myself because I was like, Trina is not going to gank top at like level 3. Like he just won't. And sure enough, he just continued to farm until level 4, and then he did actually end up going up top later. But my point is that I don't think so. Like I think Fnatic and even maybe UOL to some extent could adjust their draft slightly and focus a bit more on getting those like early laning leads if they pick more winning matchups. But Trick is this weird sticking point for me on G2, and maybe it's just because I look at junglers a lot, but I don't see him changing his playstyle ever.
He
like
doesn't.
I just
if he has it, like I feel like right now you have a lot more points where a jungler will have a tempo advantage, right? Like just because of the way that camps respawn. And I feel like Trick hasn't figured out what to do with tempo advantages. He just kind of like drops them, or he'll.
It's so frustrating. Oh my god! like there's so many times when he could be proactive and he just doesn't do it, and I'm like, why? Like why?
He doesn't even do like take advantage of good back times or anything. It's just really bizarre. Like when we say be proactive or use tempo advantage, we don't necessarily mean gank, right?
Yeah,
like,
I'm not saying he has to like I made the joke about him ganking at level 3. I'm not saying he has to be in lanes all the time. Like he totally doesn't. Like it's a timing thing on where he's pathing, whether he can like invade. It's like all down to timing and map pressure. It doesn't have as much to do with like. Because, yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I think a lot of people translate early aggression into ganking. That's not necessarily what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of things you can do with tempo advantage. There's, like, invade for vision, there's invade for camp denial, there's, I guess, fake pressure in lane, there's getting a good back timing, clearing river vision. There are all sorts of things that you can do as a jungler with a tempo advantage, and it just feels like he doesn't do anything. So, yeah, that's a bit of the problem that we're seeing with Trick.
On the flip side, Svenskeren looked pretty good today.
That's true. I mean, Svenskeren looked a lot better. I think part of the issue is that, again, we're seeing a lot of teams that have poor sort of mid-jungle synergy. Trick defaults to ganking mid a lot, but the timing is often off, and
Xerxes.
Xerxes
I mean,
has...
We touched upon it.
We talked about Xerxes and Exileh. Caps usually just has mid pressure. I mean, he's usually like really good at having these types of 1v1 advantages because he is super mechanically gifted, just like he's the guy with all the raw talent, and he hasn't really refined it. But if you're playing against a lot of mids who want to scale up, or who prio Syndra, or prio weird things like Rise and Caston, you can just get away with it all the time. So if you're suddenly against, like, oh, I'm gonna play LeBlanc,
yeah, he did not have a fun time.
It's a bit trickier. So, and I feel like Jensen, Perks, a lot of these mid laners that he's had trouble with used to kind of be caps, so they know it's like, I know what you're doing. So I think that also a point worth bringing up. Alright, so we've kind of talked a little bit. Do we have any warning signs or anything to be worried about for TSM? Do we think that TSM are the best team at this tournament?
Oh man, that's really difficult for me to say, only because I harp a lot on their weaknesses. And I don't think we saw them... I think the first game was a good example of some of the best of TSM and some of the worst of TSM, where like their draft here relied on a very specific ult combination that they didn't figure out how to kind of synergize correctly until about like 30 minutes after more than a few tries, I guess. So that's the only thing that's like kind of concerning for me for TSM, is that sometimes they still don't know how to come together with their comp and execute it correctly when it comes to like not early game, early mid game, and then like transitioning from that through mid game to late. I think once they get to late game, they have a pretty good understanding of what to do, because their default is just to kind of like, even if they get early advantages, to kind of wait it out and capitalize on other North American teams' mistakes, which has worked pretty well for them. Up to a point. Obviously, we saw them lose before coming here to Cloud9, where that didn't work in their favor. I think so. Sven Skaren looking good today was a really good sign for me. I still think that he can definitely be punished. And so I'll be curious to see them go up against Fnatic, actually, especially if Fnatic can adjust from today.
Yeah, I'm not really
I think
Fnatic
could give them trouble.
Yeah, I think if Fnatic sort of play the way they did against Splice last week, which was they went for more of an early snowball setup in strong lanes and this type of approach, but then they played the more cautious mid game. So I think that that could be really effective against TSM. But we'll see if they want to do that, or they want to keep messing around with how they're trying to play the game and use this tournament more as a learning experience. But I do think that they have a lot of emotional players who are reckless, who really want to succeed and don't like losing. So I have a feeling that if it gets a little rough, they'll change it up.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks everyone for watching. We'll try to do this again tomorrow, and have fun.
And every day after that. Bye.